Welcome to the Tepper School of Business Multimedia Series. For more information on the Tepper School at Carnegie Mellon, please visit us at www.tepper.cmu.edu/multimedia. And now, here's your selected video.
On behalf of the student body and the Tepper School, I would like to present Sir Mark Moody-Stuart. He's a geologist and businessman who has worked with Oil, Gas and Mining Corporation in 10 different countries. He was formerly chairman of Shell and the mining company Anglo-American, and serves or has served on boards of major companies including Accenture, HSBC and the Saudi state oil company Saudi Aramco. He has been involved with the United Nations Global Compact since its foundation in 2000 and is vice chairman of its board. In 2014, he published his book, Responsible Leadership: Lessons from the Front Line of Sustainability and Ethics. Please help me welcome Mr. Sir Mark Moody-Stuart.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Axel. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming in your lunch hour, which I see you're making good use of. That's efficient use of time, most important. It is a pleasure to be here, and I just had a session with a dozen or so MBA students, and we had a lot of excellent questions. So what I'm going to do is talk for about half the time and have you ask questions. And please feel free to ask questions on any topic. I have all sorts of things in my background which may intrigue people, from Nigeria to controversial subjects. So feel free to ask questions on anything. I'm not embarrassed about it. What I am going to talk about is the role of business in relation to developing countries and countries in general. One of the great privileges of working around the world in many different countries is the ability to see over a period of 40 years or more, you can see how long I've been at it from my hair, what the impact of resources industry is on those countries, where it went positively and where it had negative impacts, and what we could do and what are the responsibilities of government in relation to it. You'll be well familiar with the resource curse arguments and so on. What happens when a wall of resource money hits an unprepared economy? And there are negative consequences, there's no doubt about it. There can be, but they're not essential. Negative consequences of overvalued exchange rates, squeezing out of other parts of the economy, agriculture, and so on. I take three particular, so you look at what works and what are the key ingredients and what can we do when they go wrong. And one of my conclusions is that a key ingredient is actually the government and government leadership, which may seem strange for a businessman. I always say, you don't know how much you need government till you've lived in a country in which it doesn't exist. The three countries I normally look at, Oman, Malaysia, and Nigeria. And those countries have a different evolutionary pattern over the last 40 years. Oman is, when I first worked there as a field geologist, was a truly medieval country. It's now transformed to a modern, light industrial economy with problems, but nonetheless, it's benefited enormously from resources. Malaysia, when I first worked there, was first involved in the 60s, was a country dependent on primary products, where you could frankly tell the occupation of a person by looking at them, whether they were Chinese, Indian, or Malay, or European. And now, 40 years later, that dependency on primary products, palm oil, tin, oil and gas, and so on, isn't there anymore. And the resources have been wisely used to build and change the economy. And you can no longer tell people's occupation by looking at them, which is a big achievement in 40 years. Not perfect. Nigeria, on the other hand, over the same period of time, a hugely populous and creative nation, the outcomes are plainly less satisfactory. We have poverty, widespread environmental damage, social tensions, awful things happening, both in the north and in the delta. If you analyze this, one of my conclusions is that actually it's the leadership of the country. It's not the people. All three have creative populations. They have strong civil societies. All three have strong religious trends going through them, different religions in different parts. But the leadership has been different. In Oman, you've had 40 years of a very enlightened, admittedly absolute ruler, but who's developed a bicameral parliament with women in the lower house and in the upper house, an elected chamber and an appointed chamber, and transformed the country. In Malaysia, for 20 of those 40 years, you had Mahathir Mohamad, who, like him or don't like him, is a remarkable leader who inspired the country and transformed it. It's having some difficulties now. Maybe one of the difficulties is that Mahathir Mohamad has never quite been able to resist the temptation of advising his successors and interfering with them. In Nigeria, for over half that time, it's been subject to military rule with governments who probably governed more in relation to their own benefit, individual benefit, than in the interests of the country as a whole. So one of my conclusions is that a very big difference is actually the nature and leadership of the government. So the question is, if you operate in a country with bad leadership, bad government which may be guilty of human rights abuses, where corruption is endemic, what are the responsibilities of a company working in that? Because you have to ask yourself, what do we do? Should we be here at all? Well, one option, of course, is that you could withdraw. Simply say, life's too difficult. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, many companies, and those who were actually partly involved in the creation of the economy are thinking of withdrawing, which I think is a great pity and incorrect. So you could withdraw. For a resource industry, of course, that tends to be not the default option because the resources are there. But nonetheless, for the human rights community and others, I think whereas there was a long period where withdrawal was very popular, culminating in the withdrawal of Talisman from Sudan, I think people have come to recognize that doesn't necessarily improve the situation. Having responsible companies engaged can be beneficial, and I'll come back to talk about what's a responsible company. The third option is not one open to companies, but is to impose sanctions of one sort or another, military, economic, and so on. I'm not an enthusiast certainly not of the military sort. I'm not an enthusiast for the economic sort either, because the record, if you look at it, is bad. You can start with Cuba and go on. People will say, yeah, but it works in Iran. Yes, maybe. But it has worked after 30 years of destroying a society and the economy. It's destroyed the private sector. Such economy as there is concentrated in the hands of the government, and they use that power very effectively to reinforce their position. And I've been in Iran a couple of times recently, and you can see if we had, in my Shell days, Every time we were prevented by sanctions from doing something, the technocrats lost power and the wild guys gained power. So I think it's not, you could talk about Myanmar in Burma, which is another, Myanmar and Burma, which is another example where I think the lack of, the ineffectiveness of sanctions because of ASEAN countries actually enabled change, which surprised everyone. So if you're going to stay there, what's to do? I think one of the most encouraging things in the past 20 years has been the development of processes by which civil society works in alliance with businesses to solve specific problems. This started in traded goods, things like Sustainable Forest Stewardship Council, traded timber products, Marine Stewardship Council, constructive civil society saying, look, we need business to fix this, and constructive business saying, what are the rules we need to do this? As I said, it started in traded goods, timber, products of different sorts now, sustainable palm oil, chocolate, and so on, but then went into other areas to establish what the rules of behavior were. Rules hammered out in discussion between civil society and constructive businesses. It went into areas such as diamonds, illicit diamonds, conflict diamonds, through the Kimberley process, through the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative on corruption, trying to look at throwing light on the great flows of funds which come from extractive industries. The biggest of these collective alliances is the United Nations Global Compact, which was formed as a result of former Secretary General Kofi Annan challenging businesses to embed in their day-to-day business, the principles which were based on the major conventions of the United Nations, the conventions which every country signs up to, the Convention on Human Rights, the ILO conventions on working conditions and labor, the Rio Convention on Environment and Development, and subsequently corruption, when there became in 2003 an International Convention Against Corruption, which still has we've got a lot to do still. Lots of countries have signed up to it, but they're not yet doing what they should be doing. And I don't mean the corrupt countries. I mean the countries where much of the corrupt money sits, which is in parts of Europe, London and others, and here in the United States. And there are commitments under that convention. So, but companies don't just, and there were initially only 40 companies, I think, they don't just sign up to it. They have to, which is relatively easy, and some of them did sign up to it thinking, who could be against these high-flown principles? Of course, we respect them. But then you have to report against progress on each of the 10 principles, what you're doing. It's not a standard, but report, are you making progress? And this has a kind of general lifting up of performance. And the Global Compact now has around the world 8,000 companies, half of which are in developing countries, many countries in China, companies in China, India, Latin America, and so on. And I believe it begins to make a difference also through its local networks, local chapters, which bring together in each and every country business, civil society, labor unions, if they're allowed, government, often local government, big businesses, international businesses, national businesses, small businesses, to address what the major problems in that country are. And I think that's a very important development, and I believe it's a way forward for business, because businesses operating in this way, applying those principles, talking about how they can actually apply the principles. And initially, of course, people paid most attention. All companies know something about working conditions. Most companies were doing something on the environment. When it comes to human rights, for the first 6 or 8 years, many companies said, you know, if you say human rights to a company, they think this is imprisoning people or torturing them, and we don't do that, so it's nothing to do with us. Child labor, you know, we're not doing. Actually, people pretty soon discovered that there were many things which, so it's an educational process to show how in your day-to-day business you can make progress. So as I said, I have a strong belief that in countries where far from everything is perfect, the operation of responsible businesses is and can be beneficial. By working with, whether they're national businesses or international businesses, by working and improving conditions and demonstrating through that these things are not going to cost the earth and that they are actually beneficial in the long run is very important. As I said, there are difficulties and dangers in this. One of the questions I had in our small discussion just now was, how do you handle in countries when you're dealing with a government, if you're a major company, a major economic actor, and you're dealing with governments who are guilty of human rights abuses, who may not have very good habits in one way or another. And you cannot operate in the country without engaging with that government and indeed with the individual. There is an argument, the strongest argument for withdrawal, for example, in Sudan, which is still under sanctions, where the UN Global Compact has a local group, is that the activities of these responsible companies in the extractives pay taxes, and the taxes go to a government, and the government may misspend the taxes or spend them on security and so on. That's probably the strongest argument. You cannot have economic activity without the government, good or bad, having some benefit from that economic activity. You just have to hope that the rest of society also benefits and that through that change comes about. But when you're dealing with individuals, I remember a colleague of mine who used to deal with General Abacha, Sani Abacha in Nigeria. I think he was probably one of the last people who actually had access to him, and he said it really made him extremely uncomfortable because he could not normally see the guy until he'd sit around from early evening. He'd see him at 1 or 2 in the morning. The television would be going on with CNN in the background, and it was quite difficult to have a reasonable conversation. That, I think, is an extreme example. I've had myself personal dealings with the late President Assad, the father of the present president in Syria. I've never met the present president, but you could see with the father, an extremely intelligent man, you could begin to understand what drove him in certain directions. And the important thing, I think, is not to condone this and to discuss why it's not a good idea. So to make absolutely plain that your values are your values and you think they might be beneficial to him, but that you at least talk to the person and establish some kind of human contact. I think without that human contact, we will never make progress. And I discovered that Martin Luther King said that you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. I think that's very true. If your lip is curling when you're talking to the guy, and incidentally, that applies just as much to a business person. When someone from civil society comes in and you feel that they are fundamentally anti-business, that they really wish you would cease to exist, and they're having great difficulty talking to you, it doesn't put you in a very responsive frame of mind. So I suppose you're the same as your average dictator. The other thing that's important, I think, I mean, that's an individual and personal factor. The other thing I think which is important is actually the corporate values and how behavior is around the organization. I was in the World Economic Forum once with some civil society organizations talking about behavior in organizations. And one of the heads of a major civil society organization, a development organization around the world, he said, I have 60,000 people working around the world. How do I know on any one given day that they're all acting in line with our principles and what we tell the public and our funders that we're doing? I had great pleasure. I think he didn't appreciate it. I said, welcome to the club. You are now a multinational. Because that's the situation all of us are in. We need to be sure that we are operating in line, that everyone in the organization has bought into the process. How do you do that? I think the first thing is in how the values were developed. And a good crisis, frankly, helps. In Shell, when we had a terrible year in '95 with the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Brent Spar debacle, so an environmental issue and a human rights issue, it really shook us, and it shook the self-esteem of everyone around the organization. So it's an ideal moment to say, actually, what are the values? We thought we had good standards. We thought we lived according to them. So we went to people right across the world in 80 different countries and said, with workshops, cross-sections of Shell people and other people, and said, what do you think the responsibilities of a major international corporation are? And out of that, we changed our existing, I thought, very good business principles, and then fed them back to these people and said, okay, this is what we now, what do you think of this? And they said, pretty good, we don't think you can do better, but how do we know you do it? You have to report on it openly and publicly, which is what we then started to do. But it's also important, so in how you get agreement and make sure that these are not just values. It doesn't matter whether they're global compact principles, individual corporate values. If you don't work to embed those values throughout the organization, you might just as well not have them. And one of the most important ways of doing this is to demonstrate the consequences. And by that I mean, I give you an example from when I was running the upstream business, the producing business in Shell around the world. We had a big safety drive. Our safety performance had plateaued, and we analyzed accidents, problems that we'd had, and came to the conclusion there were two main drivers. One was that normally someone in the operation had felt uncomfortable about what was being done. but hadn't felt empowered to actually do something about it or felt it wasn't their responsibility. And the other was that they'd started up the operation in a new operation before they'd done all the training. They weren't quite ready, but they had a deadline to meet, so they went for it and said, be all right on the night, and it wasn't. So we sent out a message saying, delay the operation rather than start it up untrained. And anybody has the right to put their hand up and say, stop, and we'll stop the operation. And for about 2 years, when I went round the business talking to groups of people like you, I could be pretty certain that at the back of the audience at some point, someone would stick their hand up and say, Mark, are we not still sending mixed messages about production versus safety? My initial reaction was, can't you read? There's a letter signed by me on your notice board saying you have a right to stop it. And then I realized, of course, the problem was not that they could not read. They didn't really believe it, which is quite worrying. And those of you who work in business know that you can say something at the top and people will question. Now, why are they saying that? Are they saying that because it's the right thing to say, or do they actually really believe it? And it's quite worrying when you realize that people don't, within your own organization, don't necessarily, deep in their hearts, they're not quite sure whether you really mean it. And you can fix that, I think, by finding examples and making positive examples out of them. So finding people who did shut the operation down and who said, got credit for it. And in another organization I work, I'm going to have to stop in a minute, another organization in which I work, they actually, post Macondo in the Gulf of Mexico, which we could talk about, I mean, there were plainly miscommunication. They went round all the organizations, and I said, how did you get on in Shell? And they said, well, very interesting. They told me that they had a platform in the North Sea which production had been shut down by the cook. I don't know the background of it, but I felt very happy. I thought, something stuck. So that, I think, is important. The other thing that's important is to, in areas like corruption, is to demonstrate examples where you didn't bribe someone and it cost you a contract or it cost you money. But also talking very openly in engagement sessions like this about examples and where is the line, are there some things which some people might regard as corrupt, and which might be acceptable, Does a traditional New Year gift to the policeman on duty at the end of the road of a box of chocolates, is that corruption or is that general practice? So by discussing that, I think you bring things out. The last thing I think is, and I'm aware of that in my role as a board of directors, is visits by boards of directors and people to operations around the country and by shareholders, where you can actually test whether, what people are saying. Have they got the message? So if I had to define a responsible company who should, I believe, even be encouraged to operate in countries with difficult environments, I would say that it's a company which has clear values embedded through the organization and has mechanisms for testing that that's the case. It's a company which has accountability to public shareholders and consumers, both of whom are very important levers on countries. A company which is open to communication with civil society and other organizations. So if you go, and I remember when I talked to President Assad, talking to human rights groups, and I said, listen, you don't know what I'm saying to him. You have to trust me. There are only two people, me, him, and the interpreter, which he didn't actually need. but he used. I am quite happy to tell you what I said, but you have to believe me, and I have to trust you that when I tell you what I said, you're not going to noise it around the world, because otherwise I won't get to see him again if I tell you what we really talked about. So I think that transparency and openness is extremely important. If I had 2 bits of advice to you as business school people, I would say the 2 bits are, 1, be very open, and to you teaching in business schools, one thing that schools tend not to teach is to listen to people outside in society, including people who you don't agree with and who you may think are foolish, because they're probably not foolish, and if they are, they got the idea from somewhere and you better address it. So openness, I think, is extremely important. And the other thing which is extremely important, I think, is an ability to, as a business person, put on your your societal hat, take off your corporate one, and join with others in working with governments to establish the frameworks which are absolutely essential if the market is to work. Regulatory frameworks, and regulation is not a popular word, particularly in this country, but it is very important, the proper sort of regulatory framework. I think I've said enough, so thank you very much.
So we have a couple mics on both ends here, so if you just want to raise your hand, we'll take questions. I think over there.
Someone over there.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Alexandra Cosseron. I'm actually not a business student. I'm a PhD student from the Engineering and Public Policy Department, and I'm working on sustainable energy transition. So I was very interested what you said about engaging business in countries that are not so good in different various ways, especially like when you have to pay tax and then the money goes to the government. I'd like to have your opinion about corruption. You kind of mentioned it several times. I have especially in mind country like Cambodia. Cambodia is not that bad of a country, but it's kind of, they have a major issue about energy and it's heavily corrupted. So would it be a good idea to like invest in this kind of country, knowing that part of your money is going to end up directly in corruption? Thanks.
By part of your money, you mean that tax revenues will be diverted corruptly from the central bank or the Ministry of Finance to be stolen?
Like when I was there were like a deal being negotiated with a Chinese company, and it was like open and every of the knowledge of everyone that half of the price they were paying was corruption. So,
well, I think that's true. It will only be countered if the company and the country and the owners of the organization are committed to it not happening and can see the benefit of it not happening. It certainly does happen. I remember, going back in time, I remember even a US company operating in one of the stans. I knew at the time they were using a fixer basically, who'd approached us, and I knew how much they paid, and I was astonished that they could get away with it. I even talked to the lawyers. I said, how do they square that with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? And he said, there's only one way, that they assume that it will not come out in the end. In fact, it kind of came out, because the person, the fixer, eventually was put in jail in the United States. And the major corruption in the European industry was the European state oil companies. So ELF, and that's well documented. The President Director General of ELF, a man called Loïc Lefroc-Prigent, who I knew and who I had on a mental list I had of people who should be in jail, who's on a slightly shorter mental list of people who actually went to jail, was found guilty of corruption. But in a way, I felt a bit sorry for him because he was acting as an organ of the state. He was doing what Mitterrand wanted him to do. So, yes, but it's not necessary. You can operate, on occasion not operate. You will lose contracts because somebody will distort the process. But there are mechanisms, I think, of getting together with others to try and clean up the process. And the organization Transparency International has collaborative mechanisms for trying to prevent it. And the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, not sure if Cambodia is a signatory to it. There are 30-something countries, and they're not all perfect, but it's the beginning of process. And one of the things they have to do is have an independent civil society, an independent non-governmental business and civil society organization overseeing the process, and they have to guarantee that they will not put those people in jail or take other action against them. It's a long, slow process, and when corruption is deeply embedded and large amounts of money, there are large funds and vested interests, it's mighty difficult to reverse. But it's been done. It's done in this country, in many countries in Europe, which were also highly corrupt.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm Evan Zhang, come from Tepper School, first year MBA students. And I came from Beijing, China. These days, people are concerned about the air quality, as everyone knows. So 5 million cars running on the street in Beijing city. So the first majority concern is come from the standard of the gasolines. So in China, people right now is discussing about who should set up the standard of the quality of the gasoline. And right now, the Department of Environment Protections all come from, the majority of people come from the oil and gas companies. So I'm interested in the topic that you mentioned. The company should collaborate with the government to establish something to protect people. But right now, it seems like these people are more willing to protect their benefits from the corporate perspective. I want to know what's your view on that. Thanks.
Well, I've visited your country many times, and I've just been there, in fact, at something called the China Development Forum, which brings together international business, Chinese ministers, the Premier, the Minister of Finance, Deputy Premier, and so on, to address different issues. And over the 15 years that I've been attending, you can see progress and change. But it's sometimes slow progress. I think there have been enormous areas of progress, but at cost. So there's huge economic progress at environmental cost. And the present administration is beginning, I think, to address it. I think it's sensible to have... One of the problems in China, I think, is that, my engagement with my argument that companies should engage with government on regulatory framework is qualified by saying it should not be companies alone, it should be companies and civil society organizations. Because you need those two elements to keep each other honest, otherwise you get exactly that suspicion or fact. Now, the major Chinese companies, CNPC, is a signatory of the Global Compact, so I hope they're behaving extremely reputably and properly. So I think the combination of people, of civil society, and that is a problem in China. I think the engagement of civil society organizations, not government-organized, non-governmental organizations, genuine civil society organizations. But there's something else called the China Council for International Environment and International Cooperation on Environment and Development. And I sat on that for a while with the Minister of Environment and a lot of European and Canadian government involvement, actually working on precisely that. What are the standards? And the emission standards are going up. I mean, I know from a nephew who's trying to sell vehicles in China that they're now extremely tough. I mean, they're equivalent to the European or the planned North American one. So it will happen.
Thank you for the talk. I'm a second year MBA student. My name is Jairaj. I guess you mentioned the engagement of the civil society in the corporation. So my question comes more from a specific standpoint of a corporation. If you are dealing in pharmaceuticals or a commodity that could actually benefit the civil society by your presence in that country, what would your response be when the civil society tries to engage you in actually letting you stay there, or at least try and convince you to go to a country where the trade practices are not completely transparent, but that actually benefits the society because you could either provide that service or good more qualitatively, or at a much more cost benefit?
Well, I believe that it's in the interest of business to look at opening new markets, and that's a new market. But markets will need they need a framework. They need. In my own experience, I've had governments ask us to, in Shell, to go into the liquefied petroleum gas business, bottled gas, which is an essential transformation from, wood and charcoal to and kerosene to more modern cooking methods. And in some cases, we had to say it's economically impossible unless the regulations to prevent underfilling of bottles are tightened up, because we could not make a profit in a controlled margin environment if the bottles are full, because the margin is insufficient. The national business covers that by not filling the bottles. So something has to give. Either you have to increase the controlled margin or do that, but you also have to make sure that people get out of the bad habit of not filling bottles. So I think the question is the market, are there things in the market which prevent you from that you could not run a business because of cheating by others, or could you, through a proper brand with dilution, adulteration, which of course is a marketing advantage. If people know they can trust your product and your bottles are full, they may be more expensive, but you get what you pay for, then you could probably develop a market. So I think it requires analysis as to what are the real barriers, rather than are there just some bad practices, because there will be bad practices.
I think we have time for maybe one more question here from...
Hi, I'm Kara Bartlett, a first-year MBA student. I'm curious, a couple of your topics today have touched on resource curses or the role of good governance. I'm curious your thoughts on the role of the international community in the future of Afghanistan, especially considering that they have significant mineral wealth that is currently untapped, and if there is a role for that community now that the military is pulling out in terms of establishing good governance or some semblance of a stable economy.
I have limited experience with Afghanistan, although I've talked to people who are involved there and looked at the mining industry. It's very difficult for many international companies because of the security situation. You have to say, can I really ask people to go there if they may be killed? And I remember that situation in Algeria when the FIS was killing people very effectively, and specifically foreigners. And there's a difference between a country where there's a sort of general danger that someone may set off a bomb and you get hit, collateral damage, as it were, from a suicide bomber or something. But if they're actually aiming specifically at your people and going to kill them, it would be a tough decision to take. So you'd have to look at that very, very closely. I think there is a lot that can be done with supporting national businesses. I've visited Sudan quite a lot. I'm actually quite fond of Sudan. It's a difficult country, but it has some outstanding Sudanese businesses. Some of the best businesses. I mean, there's a company there, a food products company, which I would be proud to work for. And it's entirely run by Sudanese, and they are transforming the society in the interest of their business. I mean, this is not philanthropy, it's business. So I would say start perhaps with the national companies. I think the Global Compact, we don't have a network in Afghanistan. We have one in Sudan, where international business and national business can learn from each other. So the national businesses can, and that's why I encourage people to join them, because the national businesses can teach the international businesses some of the things that they've learned on how to get around these problems. And the international businesses can also demonstrate that by having high standards, you don't actually wreck the business. Your working conditions and so on can be way above the average, and you actually have a better business. So this practical demonstration of the business benefits of responsible business is, I think, extremely important. And something like the Global Compact and these codes developed on mining or natures of mining or even specific parts of mining, what proper processes for handling mercury and so on are very important.
All right. Thank you so much for the speech. I hope you all enjoyed it. And let's put your hands together for Mr. Mark Moody-Stuart.
Could I thank you?